I love studying different patterns. The minute you become aware of a pattern, I think you become aware certainly of where you lie on that particular pattern, but also, for me, it's an invitation to explore the other sides of a pattern. Um, so the pattern that I thought would be interesting to explore today is how people make comparisons. And I think it's sort of the nature of our thinking that inherently we make comparisons and we compare things, we contrast things, we make distinctions. One pattern is that some people notice differences between things and other people notice similarities. So that unto itself is very interesting. Are you somebody who notices more distinctions? What are nuanced differences between things, or are you somebody that notices that this is like that? And although that's an interesting pattern, the pattern that I want to explore right now is that of making comparisons. And so I'll mention a few things. I think we make comparisons in many different ways, but some people compare themselves to others, right? It seems pretty obvious. You might compare yourself to how somebody else does something that you do. In school, we take tests and we get a grade, and it's very common that we would compare ourselves to other people's grades. The grading system kind of implies that, right? It's not that you get your own grade in a vacuum. You're graded, and those grades are compared to other people's grades. Sometimes there's a curve based on how everyone did. So that's a self to other comparison. And I don't think any of these are particularly good or bad. They have different properties to them. So there are times where I could compare myself to others, and I can use that to strive or to set a new standard for myself, and that can be motivating. I could also use it to judge myself or to get down on myself, and that would be less fun. So self to other is one type of comparison. Then there's self to self comparisons. So a self to self comparison might be that I compare how I did on something today versus on how I did yesterday, or how I did a week ago or 6 months ago. And that also can be empowering, right? Like if I'm making progress, I can get excited. Okay, I'm trending in a direction that I like. So that's one type of self to self comparison. You can also compare yourself to not your past self, but your future self. Now, if you set a goal that's sort of somewhat realistic, I don't like using that term always, but that can be motivating. It's like, okay, I've set this goal and I'm right here, right now. And I'm trending in a direction that I like. So that would be a self to self comparison, but it's self to future self. And sometimes people make a comparison to an ideal, whether it's the self to self or self to ideal self, or self to other kind of ideal self. So if I make a self to self comparison and it's some sort of ideal, it might be that it could be like a should, like people should perform at this level. And so inherently I'm comparing myself to other people, but also I might be holding myself to that standard. And again, it could be empowering if it motivates me to actually do some work, but it can also just be another stick that I'm beating myself with. Also, I think when people get caught up in perfectionism, that's a self to an ideal expectation. Very often, that's one way of doing perfectionism, and it's how am I now versus how am I? How is this fixed ideal? And it doesn't speak about progress, which is problematic. it's either I'm doing well or I'm not doing well. It's not, am I doing better than I did yesterday, or am I doing better than I did 6 months ago, which, that's a different topic. This idea of a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. A fixed mindset is, I'm making an evaluation about, am I succeeding, or am I being successful in what I'm doing, or am I failing? It's not, am I making progress? Am I growing? Am I moving in the right direction, or a direction that I want to move in? So these certainly aren't all the ways you can make comparisons, but these are some of the dials and switches you can play with. Am I comparing myself to someone else? And also, is it you can compare yourself to where someone is today, or you can compare yourself to where someone was at an earlier time. It's interesting, in this book, Outliers, they looked at people like Bill Gates or the Beatles, and there's a couple other examples, people who are outstanding in their field. And what they found with Bill Gates was he was a computer genius, a programming genius. He also had access to tools that other people didn't have access to at a much, much younger age. So let's say you're 30 years old and you knew Bill Gates and you compared yourself to him. It would be a bit of an unfair comparison, even though he is, a genius, because he had already been at that with access to better tools since he was about, 15 or 16. So he had been programming so long that it would be unfair to make that sort of naive comparison of like me to this person. So you really have to look at what the other person did. Also, people have different growth curves. Some people sort of have a very rapid curve in the beginning, and then sort of level off, and then other people sort of start to increase in their ability much later. I went to school with one guy who, when I met him, was not, the best musician that I had heard. He was okay. He was, he was solid, but not that great. But in time, all of a sudden, his growth curve just really started moving up and up and up. And then, now he's a really phenomenal professional musician. So self to other comparison, self to self, self to past self, no matter, different lengths of time, self to future self, or the idea of a self to some kind of platonic ideal. So those are some things you can play with. And when I do this, what I'm interested in for myself is improvement or progress. So I try to find the comparisons that are actually going to motivate action, as opposed to just motivating me feeling a certain way. There was a time that I met a guy who seemed to be at a similar point in his career, and yet he had achieved all this success. And first I was like kind of upset, and I was a bit jealous, but I used the jealousy. I sort of sat down and I thought about it, and I thought, what's he doing differently than I am? And is there something that I can learn from this? Instead of just feeling bad about it, how can I use that to propel me? Now that worked for me. That may not work for other people. Somebody who is disempowered by a self to other comparison may want to do more self to self comparisons. What I recommend is that you try out the array of these and see which configurations work best for you. And as always, have some fun with that.